Welcome. I've told a lot of stories, but this one's a favorite of mine. Get comfortable. I think you're going to feel this one.
The gravel road hadn't changed. That was the first thing Micah noticed. The thing that hit him harder than he expected as his rental car crawled over, the familiar ruts and washboard bumps, dust rising gold in the late afternoon light. 8 years, and the potholes were exactly where he remembered them. Like the land itself had been waiting for him to come back and relearn its shape. He gripped the wheel tighter than necessary. His knuckles had gone pale somewhere around the county line, when the GPS lost signal and his body took over from memory alone, turning without thinking at the leaning mailbox. With the faded name, Strand painted on the side, past the Henderson's place, past the dead oak that lightning had split in two, back when he was maybe 10 years old. Everything smaller than he remembered, everything the same. He told himself the whole flight from the city that this would be simple. Fly in, meet the lawyer, sign whatever needed signing, get a realtor's sign planted in the yard, and fly back out before the farm could get its hooks into him again. 3 days, maybe 4. His father was gone, had been gone 2 weeks now, though it had taken that long for the estate lawyer to track Micah down. For the truth of it, to catch up with him in his apartment, 40 stories above a city that had nothing to do with hay bales or fence lines or fathers who didn't know how to say the things that mattered. Micah had built a life specifically far away from all of this. He photographed strangers for a living now, captured other people's faces in clean white studios with softboxes and silence, and he had told himself for 8 years that it was enough. That this, the farm, the fields, the ghosts, was a chapter closed. He rounded the last bend, and the house came into view. White paint, gone grey, and peeling at the corners, the porch sagging slightly on the left side, the way it always had, like the whole structure, was permanently leaning to listen for something. Grief hit him low and sudden in the chest, a physical thing, and he had to blink hard against it, foot easing off the gas, until the car rolled to a stop just past the old windmill. That was when he saw him. Out past the near pasture, where the fence line ran along the tree break, a man was crouched at a post, one arm braced against it, the other swinging a mallet, an easy, practiced rhythm. Even from this distance, 100 yards, maybe more, something in Micah's body recognized him before his mind caught up. The set of the shoulders. The way he moved, like the work, cost him nothing. Like his body had been built specifically for this, and nothing else made sense for it to do. Everett. Micah's breath went thin. He hadn't let himself think about this, hadn't let himself wonder whether Everett Cole would still be here, working land that wasn't his, tending to a man who wasn't his family, for a friend who hadn't called in 8 years. Micah had told himself Everett moved on long ago, married some local girl, had kids by now, had a life that didn't orbit this farm anymore. It had been easier to believe that than to imagine him still here, still faithful to a place and a man Micah had walked away from. As if he'd felt the weight of being watched, Everett straightened, one hand coming up to shield his eyes against the sun, and looked toward the driveway. Across the distance of the field, their eyes met. Micah didn't move. He wasn't sure he could move everything in him. Locked in place, half in the car, one hand still on the door handle, he hadn't finished pulling, his heart doing something complicated and painful in his chest. Everett didn't move either. Just stood there, mallet loose in his hand, tan and broad and older. So much older, and yet unmistakably, achingly, the same boy who used to climb through Micah's window at 16, to lie on the roof and talk about nothing until the sky started going pink. 8 years collapsed into that single look. Micah felt all of it at once. The summer nights, the long silences that had said more than words, the leaving, the note he never wrote, the calls he never made, the guilt he'd folded up so small he thought he'd lost it. And here it was, unfolding again in the space of a held breath across 100 yards of grass. Neither of them waved. Neither of them called out. There was just the look, stretching long and unbearable and full, until finally Everett lifted a hand. Not quite a wave, more an acknowledgement, like tipping a hat to weather that had rolled back in and turned back to his post, driving the mallet down again like nothing at all had happened. Micah sat there another long moment, hands trembling faintly against the wheel, before he made himself get out of the car. The beer was warm by the time Micah finally worked up the nerve to bring 2 bottles out to the porch, the sun long gone down behind the tree line, the sky bruised purple and gold at its edges. Everett was already sitting on the steps, boots off, sleeves rolled to his elbows, looking out at the yard like it was the most natural thing in the world for him to be there, which Micah supposed it was. More natural than Micah being there, probably. Didn't figure you'd still drink the cheap stuff, Everett said, taking the bottle Micah offered without looking up. Didn't figure you'd still be here, Micah said, and immediately regretted how it came out. Too raw, too honest for barely 20 minutes into the reunion. Everett huffed something like a laugh, low in his chest, and twisted the cap off his beer with the heel of his hand, a trick Micah remembered from 100 nights just like this one, except none of them had been like this one at all. Where else would I be? Micah lowered himself onto the step beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off Everett's arm, not close enough to touch. The porch boards creaked the way they always had, that same specific groan under his weight, 3rd board from the left, always the loudest. Some things really didn't change. I don't know, Micah admitted. Married, kids. Somewhere that isn't this. Tried the first one, Everett said easily, taking a pull from his bottle. Didn't take. Micah glanced sideways at him. What happened? Nothing dramatic. Sarah Neely. You remember her? She was 2 years behind us. We got married when I was 26. Lasted about 3 years before she figured out she wanted somebody who wanted to leave. And I wasn't ever going to be that guy. He said it without bitterness, just flat and easy, like reciting weather. She's up in Boise now. Good for her. The cha? I'm sorry, Micah said, and meant it, though some small shameful corner of him felt something loosen at the words, some old tension he hadn't let himself name. Everett shrugged one shoulder. Don't be. Wasn't sorry myself. Not really. Just was what it was. He looked out at the dark shape of the barn against the deepening sky. This place, I was sorry to think about leaving. They sat in silence a while, crickets starting up in the grass, the far-off lowing of a cow that still apparently belonged to somebody. Micah turned the bottle in his hands, condensation slicking his palms, and let himself just breathe the air, hay and dust, and the particular green smell of a summer evening cooling down, a smell that lived somewhere so deep in him he hadn't known it was still there until it hit his lungs again driving up that road. You could have told me, Micah said, finally quiet, that you were still here, that you were the one. He stopped, throat tightening around the rest of it. That you were taking care of him. Everett was quiet a long moment, turning his bottle slowly by the neck, watching the liquid catch what was left of the light. Wasn't my place to tell you how to run your life. Micah, you left? You had your reasons. I never once thought they were bad ones, whatever you might have told yourself in the dark, some nights. But it wasn't mine to call you up and make you feel guilty for it, so I didn't. Even when he got sick, especially then, Everett's jaw worked, and, for a second, Micah saw something pass behind his eyes, something tired and old, carried a long time, in silence. Your dad and I, we had an understanding. He needed the help, I needed the work, and somewhere to be that wasn't an empty house after Sarah left. It made sense, and somewhere in there, I guess I got attached to the old bastard. A faint smile ghosted over his mouth. He'd never say it, but I think he liked having somebody around, even if it wasn't you. The words landed soft but heavy, and Micah felt them settle into his chest like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading out into everything. He never asked you to call me. Never once. In 8 years. He was too proud for that, Everett said. You know that better than I do. And I wasn't going to go behind his back and do it for him. Figured that bridge belonged to the two of you to burn or build, not me. Micah looked down at his hands and the beer bottle, sweating between them, and felt the shape of 8 years' worth of avoidance rearranging itself into something he couldn't outrun anymore. I told myself he didn't want me here. That leaving was easier for both of us. I built this whole story where staying away was doing him a favor. He laughed, short and humorless. Guess I just didn't want to come back and find out I was wrong. You weren't entirely wrong, Everett said, surprising him. He was a hard man to be around some days, even for me, and I wasn't carrying what you were carrying. I'm not going to sit here and tell you 8 years was nothing, or that it didn't cost something. It did. But I will tell you, he kept your picture on the mantel the whole time. The one from your high school graduation, where you're squinting into the sun and looking like you'd rather be anywhere else. A real smile now, small and warm. Man complained about you every other week and never once thought about taking that picture down. Micah's eyes stung, sudden and unwelcome, and he pressed the heel of his hand against them before it could turn into anything worse. Everett didn't say anything, didn't reach for him, just let the silence hold the space Micah needed. The way he always had, the same quiet patience that used to steady Micah through every bad night of his adolescence, every fight with his father, every ache Micah hadn't had words for yet. Gave up a lot, Micah said finally, voice rough. Staying here for a man who wasn't your father, taking care of a farm that isn't yours for 8 years. While I was off, pretending none of it existed. Wasn't giving anything up, Everett said. This is my life, Micah, not some sacrifice I made waiting for you to notice. I liked the work, I liked the land. I liked your old man in the end, more than I think either of us expected. He glanced over, something steady and searching in his blue eyes, catching the last of the porch light. I wasn't keeping this place warm for you to come back to, if that's what you're asking. But I'm not going to pretend some part of me isn't glad you're standing on it again. The honesty of it disarmed Micah, completely stripped away whatever careful distance he'd meant to keep for these 3 or 4 days he'd told himself this would take. 12. He looked at Everett, really looked at the lines the sun had carved at the corners of his eyes, at the grey threading faintly through the sandy blonde at his temples, at the same steady mouth that used to curve into the same half-smile every single time Micah showed up somewhere he wasn't expected, and felt something shift loose in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet, or didn't want to reach for one. I forgot how quiet it gets out here, Micah said instead, looking back out at the dark fields. The sky gone fully to stars now, more of them than he'd seen in years, more than the city ever let through. You get used to it, Everett said. Give it a few nights. Remember how to hear yourself think again. Micah huffed a small laugh, surprised by how much lighter it felt than anything he'd laughed at in months. Not sure that's something I want. Might be exactly what you need, Everett said. And there was nothing teasing in it now, just quiet certainty. The kind Everett had always carried like a second skin. He knocked his bottle lightly against Micah's. A small, familiar gesture from 100 nights years gone. Welcome home, Micah. Micah let the words settle over him, unexpectedly gentle, unexpectedly true, and for the first time since the lawyer's phone call 2 weeks ago, a small, tight thing in his chest loosened just slightly, just enough to let him breathe. Morning came, sharper than Micah remembered mornings ever being, the light slanting gold and merciless through the thin curtains of his old bedroom, and for a moment he lay there disoriented, listening to the sound of roosters he hadn't heard in 8 years, and the distant clank of something metal against something else, metal, rhythmic, patient. Already at work while he was still fighting his way out of sleep. By the time he made it downstairs, dressed in jeans that were too clean for what he was about to do, and a flannel he'd found folded in a drawer that still smelled faintly of cedar and his father, Everett was already out by the south fence line, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, a coil of wire slung over one shoulder, like it weighed nothing at all. "Didn't peg you for a sleeper," Everett called without turning around, like he'd heard the screen door before Micah even reached it. "Jet lag," Micah said, which wasn't true, since he hadn't flown anywhere, just driven 11 hours with too much coffee and too many thoughts. But it felt like the kind of lie Everett would let him keep. Sure. Everett glanced back at him, that half-smile already there, easy, unguarded, and nodded toward the toolbox sitting open in the grass. "Grab the pliers! You're on wire duty." "I don't remember volunteering." "You didn't. That's how farms work." Everett crouched at the fence post, testing a leaning strand with the flat of his palm. Nobody asks. Everybody just ends up doing something. Micah picked up the pliers anyway, the metal warm already from the sun, and crouched down beside him, close enough that he could smell the hay and sweat and machine oil that had always seemed to live permanently in Everett's clothes, a smell that hit something old and unguarded in his chest before he could brace for it. "You're going to want to hold it taut right there," Everett said, nodding at a sagging section of wire, "while I staple it down." Micah did, gripping the wire with both hands, leaning his weight back the way muscle memory apparently still knew how to do, even after all these years behind a desk, and Everett's hand came down over his for just a second to adjust his grip, calloused and warm and startlingly steady. And Micah felt the touch travel straight up his arm and settle somewhere he didn't have a polite name for. "Like that," Everett said, oblivious or pretending to be, already pulling his hand back to reach for the staple gun. "You'll get blisters by lunch, city hands." "I used to have farm hands," Micah said, a little defensive. Flexing his fingers like that might prove something. 8 years ago. Everett grinned up at him from where he crouched, squinting against the sun. "Hands? Forget. Bodies don't, not all the way, but hands forget first." They worked like that for hours, moving down the fence line, post by post, the sun climbing higher and heavier overhead until Micah's shirt was stuck to his back and his shoulders ached in a way that felt almost good. Felt like something honest, after months of nothing but stale air and fluorescent lights, and a job he'd already quietly stopped caring about before he ever got the call about his father. There was something in the rhythm of it, wire and staple and post, wire and staple and post, that let his mind go quiet in a way it hadn't in longer than he wanted to admit, and every so often he'd catch himself watching the line of Everett's back as he worked instead of the fence in front of him, the way his shoulders moved under his shirt. The ease with which his body understood weight and leverage and effort, and he'd have to drag his eyes back to his own hands before Everett caught him at it. Around noon they broke to haul feed instead, heavier work, sacks slung over shoulders and carried across the yard to the trough where a handful of cattle waited, with a kind of patient, dumb hunger that Micah found he'd missed without knowing it. He grabbed one end of a feed sack, at the same time Everett grabbed the other, and for a second they both held it there, between them faces closer than either of them had probably meant, Everett's blue eyes flicking up to his and holding just a beat too long before he looked away and hefted his end higher. "Still can't lift for shit," Everett said, though his voice had gone slightly rougher than the joke needed. "I run 6 miles a day," Micah said, breathless, dropping his end onto the trough edge with more effort than he wanted to admit to. "Running's not the same as work," Everett said, and there was something underneath it, something that wasn't really about the feed sack at all, a kind of weight to the words that made Micah look at him again, really look, the way he had the night before on the porch, and found Everett already looking back, jaw tight. Yay. Something working behind his eyes, like he was building up to saying a thing he hadn't said in a long time. Maybe hadn't ever said. "Everett, you know," Everett said instead, cutting across whatever Micah had been about to ask, voice suddenly light again, deflecting so smoothly it might have fooled anyone who hadn't known him for 20 years. "For a guy who left the farm for the city, you sure do sweat like somebody who's never seen air conditioning." "That's not. I have air conditioning." Could have fooled me. Everett wiped his forearm across his brow, grinning that easy grin that didn't quite reach his eyes this time, and turned back toward the barn like the moment hadn't happened at all. Like whatever he'd almost said had been folded back up and put away somewhere Micah couldn't reach. Micah stood there a second longer than he needed to. Feed sack forgotten at his feet. Frustration and something warmer tangled together so tightly in his chest, he couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. He wanted to grab Everett's arm and ask him what he'd almost said. Wanted to shake the answer loose, but some old instinct, the same one that had kept him quiet for years before he ever left, told him to let it sit, to let it come when it wanted to, if it ever did. Asterisk. The storm rolled in fast that afternoon, the kind that gave almost no warning. Just a sudden green cast to the sky, and a wall of wind that came through the fields like something alive, bending the tall grass flat and sending the barn cats scattering for cover. Micah and Everett had been up near the north pasture checking a waterline when the first fat drops hit, and by the time they made it to the old barn, the same one Micah remembered from childhood, weathered grey wood and a tin roof that had rattled through 100 storms before this one. The sky had opened up entirely. Rain coming down in sheets so heavy it turned a yard into a blur of silver and mud. They ducked inside just ahead of the worst of it, both of them soaked through, laughing in that breathless, startled way people laugh when they've just barely outrun something. Water streaming off Everett's hair, down the collar of his shirt. Micah's own clothes plastered to him in a way that would have embarrassed him anywhere else, but here, now, felt almost like nothing at all. Well, Everett said, shaking water off his hands like a dog, that's one way to end the day early. You could have mentioned the weather app existed, Micah said, wringing out the hem of his shirt, though there wasn't much point. Weather app didn't grow up here. Everett moved toward the old workbench along the far wall, found the lantern that had apparently lived in the same spot for decades, and lit it with a match from a tin box beside it, the small flame catching and steadying, throwing long gold shadows up across the rafters and the hayloft above. Storms come up fast out here. Always have. The barn smelled the way Micah remembered it smelling, hay and dust and old wood and something faintly metallic that might have just been age, and the rain hammering on the tin roof above them was so loud it felt like being inside a drum, but underneath it there was something achingly familiar too. A memory rising up unbidden of the two of them at maybe 14, 15, caught in a storm just like this one, sitting cross-legged on hay bales, with a flashlight between them, telling half-true ghost stories until the thunder stopped scaring either of them. "We used to sit right there," Micah said, nodding toward the loft ladder, voice quieter than he meant it. "During storms, you remember?" "I remember," Everett said. Something in his voice had gone soft, unguarded in a way it hadn't been all day. He settled down onto an overturned crate near the lantern, elbows on his knees, water still dripping steadily from his hair onto the dirt floor. "You were terrified of thunder. Used to grab my arm every time it cracked. I was 12. You were 16 the last time you did it." Micah felt his face heat, despite the chill of his wet clothes, and he sat down slowly on a hay bale across from Everett, close enough that the lantern light caught both their faces, far enough that there was still space between them, charged and uncertain. "I don't remember that." "I do," Everett said simply, and there was nothing teasing in it now. No deflection, just quiet honesty that seemed to fill up the whole barn along with the rain. They sat there a while in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, listening to the storm work itself out overhead, and Micah found himself studying Everett's face in the lantern light, really studying it the way he'd let himself do the night before, and something about the storm, the closeness. The memory of every other storm they'd sat out together in this exact barn made the air between them feel thinner than it had all day, like something was finally about to give. "Can I ask you something?" Micah said, And you actually answer it this time, instead of turning it into a joke. Everett's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't look away. Yeah, okay. Why didn't you ever leave? Mike asked. You could have. You always talked about it back then, Colorado or wherever. You had plans. Everett was quiet for a long moment, turning his hands over in his lap like he was reading something written there. I don't know, he said finally, though it was clear from his face that he did know that the words were just hard to get out. Farm needed somebody after your dad's hip went bad, and then just kept needing somebody. And I guess some part of me always figured somebody would stay in case. He stopped himself, exhaled hard through his nose, tried again, in case things ever came back around. Everett? I never married, Everett said. Like the words had been sitting behind his teeth for years, and the storm had finally knocked them loose. Almost did. Once Sarah Whitfield. You remember her, good woman? I just couldn't make myself want it enough. Kept comparing everything to something I couldn't even name right, some feeling I hadn't had since. He looked up, finally, met Micah's eyes across the small distance of lantern light and rain-loud air, and didn't look away this time. Since you left, if I'm honest, some part of me never stopped being tied to you, Micah, wherever you were. I told myself it was just missing my best friend. Took me a long time to admit it might have been something else. The rain kept hammering the roof, steady and relentless, but Micah barely heard it anymore, his whole chest gone tight and full at once, something he'd spent years not letting himself hope for, suddenly sitting right there in front of him, plain and unguarded and terrifying. I didn't come back just for the farm, Micah said, voice unsteady in a way he couldn't smooth out, even if he'd wanted to. I told myself that, told the lawyer that, told my sister that, told myself that the whole drive up here. But somewhere under all of it, I think I was hoping you'd still be here. That some part of this place hadn't changed. I didn't let myself really think it until last night on the porch. But it's true. I came back, hoping it was you I'd find. For a long moment, neither of them said anything, the lantern flame flickering low and gold between them, the storm easing slightly outside, rain settling into something softer, steadier, and Everett's eyes stayed fixed on Micah's with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. Like every year of distance between them had just folded down into this one small space of barn and lantern light and rain. Guess we're both a couple of idiots, Everett said finally, voice rough, taking 8 years to say something we probably both knew. Guess so, Micah said, and found, despite everything. The grief, the farm, the 8 years of silence, that he was smiling, small and real, and a little disbelieving, and that Everett was smiling back at him the exact same way. The lantern hissed softly on its hook, throwing that same low gold light across the hay-strewn floor. And, for a moment, Everett didn't move at all, like a man standing at the edge of something he'd circled his whole life without ever letting himself step off into it. Micah could see the war happening behind his eyes, the same one that had probably been happening for years, quiet and unspoken, buried under work gloves and calloused hands, and the kind of silence men like Everett had been raised to keep. Then he crossed the distance between them. It wasn't fast. It wasn't the kind of thing you saw in movies. All hunger and certainty. Everett moved like a man wading into water. He didn't know the depth of one slow step, and then another, boots scuffing against the barn floor, until he was close enough that Micah could feel the warmth radiating off him, smell the rain, and hay, and horse, something underneath that was just *im. Micah, Everett said, and his voice cracked on it, just slightly. Just enough that Micah felt it somewhere low in his chest. Yeah, Micah breathed. Not even sure what he was answering, only that he wanted Everett to keep going, wanted whatever came next so badly it scared him. Everett's hand came up, slow, uncertain. like he half expected Micah to flinch away, like some part of him still couldn't believe this was a door that was actually open. After all the years he must have spent telling himself it wasn't, couldn't be, shouldn't be. His calloused palm brushed against Micah's jaw, rough with years of rope and fence wire and the thousand small violences of farm work, but so gentle now, like Micah was something that might break if he wasn't careful. I've never. Everett started, then stopped, jaw tightening, eyes flicking down for just a second before coming back up to hold Micah's gaze. I don't know how to do this. Not with you. I mean, I do, but I don't. Everett. Micah said his name softly, steadying him the way you'd steady a spooked animal, the way Everett himself had probably done 1,000 times with the horses in this very barn. You don't have to know how. Just, he didn't get to finish because Everett kissed him. It was hesitant at first, the barest press of lips trembling. Micah could feel it, fine tremor running through Everett's hand where it cupped his jaw, through the broad chest that was suddenly close enough to feel the thundering heartbeat beneath the flannel. But there was no mistaking the certainty underneath the nerves. No mistaking that this wasn't a mistake, or an accident, or something Everett would take back in the cold light of morning. It was deliberate. It was chosen. Micah made a small sound against his mouth, something between relief and disbelief. 8 years of wanting collapsing down into this single point of contact. And he reached up to grip the front of Everett's shirt, not to pull him closer so much as to anchor himself, because the barn seemed to tilt slightly, the lantern light swimming warm and gold at the edges of his vision. When Everett drew back, just slightly, just far enough to look at him, his eyes were dark and searching, checking, still not quite believing. "Okay?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. "More than okay," Micah said, and this time he was the one who closed the distance, sliding a hand up into that sun-bleached hair, feeling the short crop of it under his fingers, and kissed Everett again, deeper this time, slower, giving him room to find his footing, to learn the shape of it in his own time. Everett made a low sound in his throat, something raw and unguarded, and his arms came around Micah properly then, one hand splayed wide against his lower back, the other still cradling his jaw like he couldn't quite let go of the feeling of it, and Micah let himself be pulled in, let himself sink into the solid warmth of him. Into the barn smell and rain smell and 8 years of longing. Finally answered. They stood like that for a long time. The storm outside had gentled into something soft and steady, rain pattering against the tin roof in an easy rhythm instead of the earlier violent drumming, and somewhere in the stalls one of the horses shifted and snorted quietly, unbothered, as if to say the world had gone on turning, even through all of this. Even through 2 men, finally saying what they should have said years ago. Micah didn't know how long they stayed there, wrapped together in the lantern light, foreheads pressed together between kisses, breath mingling, Everett's thumb tracing slow, absent circles against the small of his back. Long enough that the storm passed fully, leaving behind that particular hush that comes after heavy rain, the drip of water off the eaves, the smell of wet earth drifting in through the gaps in the barn siding. Long enough that the lantern burned lower, its flame guttering gently, throwing longer shadows across the hay. "I used to think about this," Everett admitted quietly, his voice rough against Micah's temple, lips brushing there like he couldn't help it, like touching Micah had become necessary now in some way it hadn't allowed itself to be before. Nights out here, lone with the horses, told myself it didn't mean anything, told myself a lot of things. "Me too," Micah said. Every city I lived in, every year I told myself I was over it, over you, I'd still end up back here in my head. Some stupid memory. You teaching me to drive the tractor, you laughing at me for being scared of the bull. You were scared of the bull. I was 19, and that bull was the size of a truck. Everett. Everett laughed, then a real laugh, low and warm. vibrating through his chest where Micah's cheek was pressed against it, and Micah felt something in himself unclench that had been wound tight for the better part of a decade. He hadn't realized how much of himself he'd been holding in reserve, in defense, until this moment of finally letting it go. They didn't leave the barn until well past midnight, and even then it wasn't out of any wish to be elsewhere. The lantern had simply burned itself down to nothing, and the horses needed settling for the night, and there was a kind of domestic tenderness in doing that together, Everett showing him. Again, which stall needed extra hay. Micah holding the bucket while Everett checked the mare's leg one more time, both of them moving in that easy orbit around each other that had always been there, underneath everything, just waiting for permission to become something more. Weeks passed like that, quiet, unhurried, kind of time Micah hadn't let himself have. In years, he called the lawyer and told him to put the sale on hold. He called his sister, who was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, before saying, in a voice that sounded suspiciously thick, "I always wondered if you'd figure it out." He didn't tell her everything, not yet, but he suspected she already knew. In the way sisters always seem to know. He and Everett fell into a rhythm that felt less like building something new and more like remembering something old, something that had always belonged to them and had simply been waiting, patient, through all the years of distance and silence and grief. Morning started early, the sky still charcoal dark at the horizon, coffee brewed strong in the same battered percolator Micah's father had used for 30 years, the two of them moving through the kitchen in comfortable silence before heading out to the barn together. They repaired the fence line that had been sagging since before Micah's father got sick. They fixed the tractor, or rather Everett fixed it, while Micah handed him tools and asked more questions than were probably necessary, just to hear Everett explain things in that patient, unhurried voice of his. They painted the porch, the white paint peeling away under Everett's scraper to reveal the grey-weathered wood beneath, and put a fresh coat on that made the whole house look for the first time in years like somewhere someone actually lived, actually loved. It wasn't perfect. There were hard nights too, nights when grief crept back in unannounced, when Micah found himself standing in his father's old study, going through boxes of papers, and had to sit down on the floor, just breathe through the weight of it, and Everett would find him there, always seeming to know, and would sit down next to him without a word, just present. Just there, until the wave passed. There were nights when Everett got quiet in his own way, when the weight of finally being honest with himself, with the town eventually, in his own careful, unhurried way, pressed down on him, and Micah learned to give him that space, to let him work through it in silence, out by the fence line or down at the creek, and to be there waiting when he came back. But mostly it was good. Mostly it was better than good. It was the kind of steady, unremarkable happiness Micah hadn't let himself imagine was possible. Not for him, not with this particular ache in his chest that he'd spent 8 years trying to outrun. The morning came, weeks later, pale gold and cool, mist still clinging low over the east pasture, when Micah stood on the porch with a mug of coffee warming his hands, and watched Everett lead the horses out to graze, his broad shoulders loose and easy in the early light, sandy hair catching the sun as it crested the tree line. The farmhouse behind Micah no longer felt like a mausoleum, no longer felt like a weight around his neck or a symbol of everything he'd lost and left and failed to say. It felt like something else now. It felt simply like home. He set the coffee down on the porch railing and walked out to join Everett, boots crunching softly over dew-wet grass, and Everett looked up at him with that same smile, small, real, a little disbelieving even now, weeks in, like he still couldn't quite trust that this was his to have. Micah understood that feeling completely. He felt it himself every single morning, waking up in the same bed as this man he'd loved half his life, without letting himself call it that, waking up to calloused hands and sun-warmed skin and a steadiness that had never once, not for a single day, made him feel like he had to hide. "Fence needs mending down by the creek," Everett said, nodding toward the tree line, sunlight catching the deep blue of his eyes. Figured we could get to it before it gets too hot. Lead the way, Micah said, and fell into step beside him, the two of them walking together through the pasture grass silvered with morning dew, the farmhouse standing solid and sunlit behind them, no longer a thing to be sold and left behind, but a thing to be lived in, worked for, loved. Sometimes, Micah thought you had to leave everything behind, the place, the people, the life you thought you were supposed to want, just to understand what it was you'd been running from all along, and what it was you'd actually been running toward, all without knowing it every single time you came back. He'd spent 8 years thinking home was a place he'd buried, a chapter closed, something he could sell off and walk away from clean. But home, it turned out, had never been the farmhouse or the fields or even the memory of his father. It had been waiting for him this whole time in the shape of a man with sun-bleached hair and steady hands, standing patient in the same fields where they'd grown up together, holding a door open that Micah had been too afraid to walk through until the day he finally came home and found it. Found him, still there exactly where he'd left him. And exactly where he was always meant to be,